Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The Clock Tower by Black Hollow Stories. The town of Kingsfield was a quiet place, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone and nothing ever happened. That was until the clock tower started chiming 13 times at midnight. The clock tower had stood in the center of town for as long as anyone could remember. It was a tall, imposing structure with a face that looked out over the town like a watchful eye. Every hour, it would chime, marking the passage of time with a sound that was as familiar as the beating of a heart. But one night, something changed. Officer Sarah Mitchell was on patrol when she heard it. She had just driven past the clock tower, her headlights cutting through the fog that had rolled in from the woods. The clock struck midnight, and she counted the chimes out of habit. 1, 2, 3. But when the 12th chime faded into the night, there was a pause. And then a 13th chime rang out, maudlin and ominous, like the tolling of a funeral bell. Sarah stopped her car and got out, her flashlight cutting through the fog. The clock tower loomed above her, its face glowing faintly in the darkness. She could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it were alive, watching her. 13? She muttered to herself. That can't be right. But before she could think any more about it, she heard a sound behind her, a soft shuffling noise, like feet dragging across the pavement. She turned, her flashlight sweeping the empty street. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. There was no answer, but as she turned back to the clock tower, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure stood at the base of the tower, shrouded in shadow. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of a man, but there was something wrong about him. His clothes were tattered and stained, and his face was twisted in a mask of pain and rage. Sarah's hand went to her gun, but before she could draw it, the figure lunged at her. She stumbled back, her flashlight falling to the ground, and the figure was on her, its cold hands closing around her throat. She fought back, kicking and clawing, but the figure was impossibly strong. Its eyes burned with a malevolent light, and its breath was cold as ice against her skin. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Sarah gasped for air, her heart pounding in her chest. She scrambled to her feet, her flashlight casting wild shadows as she looked around. The street was empty. The figure was gone. But the clock tower still loomed above her, its face glowing faintly in the darkness. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in her car, her gun in her lap, staring at the clock tower. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, she went to the town hall to look through the old records. The clock tower had been built in the 1800s, and there were stories about it, stories that had been forgotten over time. There was a legend that the clock tower was built on the site of an old gallows, where criminals had been hanged. Some said that the spirits of those who had died there still lingered, trapped in the tower, waiting for a chance to return. Sarah didn't believe in ghosts, but after what she had seen, she wasn't so sure. That night, she went back to the clock tower. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she couldn't stay away. The fog had rolled in again, thicker than before, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. The clock struck midnight, and once again, it chimed 13 times. And then they came. Figures began to emerge from the fog, their shapes twisted and broken. Some were missing limbs, their wounds still fresh and bleeding. Others were burned, their skin blackened and peeling. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, their eyes fixed on the clock tower. Sarah watched in horror as they gathered at the base of the tower, their voices rising in a cacophony of screams and wails. They were the restless spirits of those who had died in violent ways, and they had been called back by the clock tower's unnatural chime. She knew she had to do something. She couldn't let them stay, couldn't let them wreak havoc on the town. But how could she stop them? As she watched, one of the figures turned to look at her. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow and empty. She reached out to Sarah, her fingers trembling. "Help us," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the wailing of the other spirits. "Help us find peace." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know how to help them, but she knew she had to try. She went back to the town hall, searching through the old records for anything that might help her. She found a journal written by the man who had built the clock tower. In it, he spoke of a curse that had been placed on the tower by the spirits of those who had died there. The only way to break the curse was to stop the clock from chiming 13 times. But how? Sarah went back to the clock tower, her mind racing. She climbed the stairs to the top, her footsteps echoing in the empty chamber. The clock's mechanism was old and rusted, but she could see that something had been tampered with. A gear had been moved, causing the clock to chime an extra time. She reached out to fix it, but as she did, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned, and there was the woman from before, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Please," the woman said, "let us rest." Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she adjusted the gear. The clock's mechanism groaned, and then, with a final shuddering chime, it stopped. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the fog. The woman gave Sarah one last grateful look before she too disappeared. Sarah stood there for a long time, staring at the clock tower. She didn't know if she had truly broken the curse, or if the spirits would return. But for now, the town was safe. As she walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that the clock tower was still watching her. And she knew that one day It might chime 13 times again. But for now, the night was quiet, and the town of Kingsfield slept peacefully, unaware of the horrors that had almost been unleashed. The end.